Tonight we journey to a land of endless hills, where valleys fold into one another like waves frozen in stone, where wildflowers bloom in every colour of the rainbow, and where the wind carries songs from places no map has ever shown. High in these rolling highlands there exists a valley that has been asleep for 1,000 years, a place where time moves differently, where dreams take root and grow like trees, and where a guardian waits patiently for the one who will finally wake it. Our story begins in a village called Thornwick, perched on the edge of the moors, where a boy named Finn lived with his grandfather in a cottage built from grey stone and memory. If bedtime stories like this one bring you comfort and wonder, subscribe to join us on more magical journeys. Each night brings a new adventure, a new world to explore before sleep finds you. Sweet dreams are just a story away. Finn was 10 years old, with dark curly hair that never quite stayed tamed, freckles scattered across his nose like constellations, and eyes the colour of honey in sunlight. He was small for his age, but sturdy, quick on his feet, and possessed of a curiosity that his grandfather said would either lead him to great discoveries or great trouble, possibly both. He lived with his grandfather in a small cottage at the very edge of Thornwick, where the cobblestone streets gave way to wild moorland and cultivated gardens surrendered to heather and gorse. The cottage was old, older than anyone in the village could remember. Its walls were built from grey fieldstone gathered from the hills, fitted together so precisely that no mortar was needed, as though time had filled the cracks with moss and lichen that made beautiful patterns in shades of green and gold. The roof was slate, dark and weathered, with a chimney that leaned slightly to the left, but had been drawing smoke faithfully for generations. Ivy climbed one wall, and in summer it was covered with small white flowers that smelled of honey and attracted butterflies by the dozens. Inside, the cottage smelled of pipe tobacco and old books, of bread baking and herbs drying, of wood smoke and the particular scent of aged paper that Finn associated with knowledge and stories. His grandfather was a scholar, or had been, before he retired to Thornwick. Now he spent his days tending his garden, reading, and teaching Finn everything he knew about history and languages and the natural world. Finn's grandfather was called Marcus by the villagers, though Finn simply called him grandfather, or sometimes Gramps when he was feeling particularly affectionate. Marcus was tall even in his old age, though he stooped slightly now, his back curved from years of bending over books and manuscripts. His hair was white as snow and fine as silk, falling to his shoulders in a way that made him look like a wizard from old stories. His hands were spotted with message but steady still, capable of turning the thinnest pages of ancient books or threading the tiniest needle when his shirt needed mending. But it was his eyes that people noticed most, deep brown, almost black, and sharp as a hawk's despite his 70-some years. Those eyes missed nothing. They could spot a bird's nest hidden in the thickest hedge, could read the weather in the colour of the sunset, could tell when Finn was troubled or excited or trying to hide something, even before Finn himself knew what he was feeling. Every morning, Finn would wake to the sound of his grandfather moving about downstairs, the creak of floorboards that had been creaking in the same places for 100 years, the clink of the kettle being filled from the pump, the scrape of the iron stove door opening to receive fresh wood. The cottage had a rhythm, a music all its own, and Finn had learned to read it like a language. He would lie in his small bed under the slanted ceiling of the attic room, watching dust motes dance in the shaft of sunlight that came through his window, listening to the morning sounds. His room was tiny, but he loved it, just space enough for his narrow bed with its patchwork quilt, whilst a small dresser that had been his father's when he was a boy, and a shelf crammed with books and treasures, smooth stones from the river, bird feathers, a jar of beetles he'd caught and released, a compass that no longer worked but was beautiful nonetheless. When he judged that grandfather had breakfast well in hand, Finn would climb down the ladder from his attic room. Not stairs, but a proper wooden ladder that you had to be careful on, especially in sock feet, and join him in the kitchen. Breakfast in the cottage was a simple but satisfying affair. Porridge made with oats from the miller, sweetened with honey from the hives behind the church, and sometimes studded with dried fruit that grandfather had preserved the previous autumn. Fresh bread when they had it, or oat cakes when they didn't, spread thick with butter from Mrs. Blackwell's dairy. Tea, strong and hot, which Finn was allowed to drink now that he was 10, though grandfather insisted he take it with milk and honey to soften its bitterness. They would eat together at the scarred wooden table that took up most of the small kitchen, with morning light streaming through the window and falling across the blue and white dishes that had belonged to Finn's grandmother, who had died long before he was born. As they ate, grandfather would often read aloud from whatever book he was currently absorbed in. Histories of ancient civilizations, bestiaries describing creatures both real and imagined, collections of folk tales from distant lands. Finn loved these breakfast readings. They made ordinary oatmeal taste like food fit for kings, made the small kitchen feel like a portal to anywhere and anywhen. He learned about the pyramids of Egypt while scraping the last of his porridge from his bowl, about the Great Wall of China while chewing thoughtfully on buttered bread, about the libraries of Alexandria and Timbuktu while sipping his sweet milky tea. After breakfast, they would share the washing up, Finn pumping water into the basin while grandfather scraped plates, grandfather washing while Finn dried with a cloth so worn and soft it felt like chamois. Then grandfather would retreat to his study, a small room lined floor to ceiling with books in what seemed like every language ever spoken, to continue his research or his writing or his correspondence with scholars scattered across the world, and Finn would be free to explore. Thornick was a small village, perhaps 60 families in all, now clustered together on the edge of the moorland like sheep huddling against the wind. The houses were built of the same grey stone as Finn's cottage, with slate roofs and small windows fitted with thick glass to keep out the weather. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin columns that the wind caught and scattered across the sky. There was a church, ancient and solid, with a square tower and bells that rang out the hours. There was a school, though it was closed for the summer now, its playground empty and quiet. There was a general store that sold everything from nails to candy to bolts of cloth. There were a blacksmith's forge where you could watch the smith, a huge man named Thomas with arms like tree trunks, hammer red hot iron into horseshoes and hinges and whatever else people needed. As there was a pub called the Shepherd's Rest, where the adults gathered in the evenings, and a dairy where Mrs. Blackwell sold milk and cream and cheese, and a mill powered by the stream that ran through the village. But Finn's favourite place wasn't in the village proper at all. It was beyond the last house, beyond the cultivated fields, out on the moor where the wild things grew, and the wind blew free, and the land rolled away in waves of purple heather and golden gorse. The moor was beautiful in a stark, spare way. It wasn't pretty like a garden or dramatic like mountains. It was subtle, requiring patience to appreciate. But once you learned to see it, really see it, it got into your blood like a song you couldn't forget. The colours shifted with the seasons and the weather and the time of day. The heather bloomed purple in the late summer, in turning the hillsides into a sea of violet. The gorse flowered yellow and smelled like coconut, blooming sporadically throughout the year. Between them grew tough grasses and tiny wildflowers, tormentil with its bright yellow petals, bog asphodel glowing orange, cotton grass waving its white tufts like flags of surrender. Birds nested in the heather, curlews with their long curved beaks and bubbling calls, skylarks that rose singing into the air, meadow pipits that hopped about industriously looking for insects. Sometimes Finn would see hawks hovering on the wind, or hear the cronking call of ravens tumbling through the sky. Once, just once, he'd seen a merlin, a small falcon swift as thought, take a pipit in mid-air, a burst of feathers and then silence. The moor was crossed by old paths, some still used by shepherds moving their flocks to different pastures, some long abandoned and barely visible now, just slight depressions in the earth, or lines of stones half buried in peat. There were ruins too, old farmsteads that people had lived in generations ago before moving closer together for safety or community, or simply because farming the moor was too hard, too uncertain. Now those ruins stood empty, their roofs long gone, their walls slowly crumbling, being reclaimed by the land that had grudgingly yielded them in the first place. Finn would spend hours walking these paths, exploring these ruins, watching the birds, collecting interesting stones or unusual plants to show grandfather later. He never went far enough to worry his grandfather. There were landmarks he knew not to pass, as boundaries he understood without them needing to be spelled out. But within those boundaries he was free to roam, and roam he did, learning the moor's moods and secrets, becoming part of its landscape. The other children in Thornick thought he was odd. They played in the village streets, organised games of tag and football, gathered in groups to share secrets and gossip. Finn was friendly enough when he encountered them, but he preferred his own company, preferred the quiet of the moor to the noise of the playground, preferred watching birds to kicking balls. They didn't mock him exactly. His grandfather was too respected for that, and besides, Finn was always kind. But they didn't really understand him either, and he didn't really understand them, and so by mutual unspoken agreement they left each other to their separate pursuits. His grandfather understood, though. Marcus had been a solitary child too, had grown into a solitary man, and he saw in Finn a kindred spirit. He never pushed his grandson to be more social, never worried that Finn spent so much time alone. He knew that solitude and loneliness were not the same thing, that Finn was perfectly content in his own company, perfectly happy with his walks and his observations and his thoughts. In the evenings, after a simple dinner, stew or soup, bread and cheese, whatever was in season from the garden, they would sit together in the parlour. Grandfather would read or write in his journal, occasionally making small sounds of interest or disagreement with whatever text he was engaged with. Finn would draw or read his own books, or sometimes just sit and watch the fire, letting his mind wander where it would. Sometimes grandfather would tell stories, not reading from books, but telling them from memory, stories he'd heard when he was young or stories he'd collected in his travels before Finn was born. Stories about heroes and monsters, about wise fools and foolish wise men, about magic that was real and magic that was metaphor and magic that was something in between. One evening in late summer, when the sun was setting in bands of orange and purple, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening east, grandfather closed the book he'd been reading and looked at Finn with an expression the boy couldn't quite read. "Finn," he said, his voice soft and thoughtful, "have you ever heard of the Sleeping Valley?" Finn looked up from his drawing, an attempt to capture the way heather looked when wind blew through it, creating waves like water. "No, grandfather. What is it?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Then he began to speak, and his voice took on that special quality it had when he was telling a story that mattered. The Sleeping Valley is a place that exists in the hills beyond the moor, in a direction that can't quite be found on any compass. It's a valley that fell asleep 1,000 years ago, when the last person who truly knew it died without passing on that knowledge. Since then, it has been dreaming, and in its dreams, wonderful things have grown. Trees that sing when the wind touches their leaves, flowers that bloom in colours that have no names, a spring that flows with water so pure it can heal any wound, cure any sickness, mend any broken thing. But the valley sleeps, overwhelmed, and all these wonders sleep with it, hidden, waiting. Finn's eyes were wide. Why did it fall asleep? Because, Grandfather said, valleys are not just places. They are living things in their own way, sustained by the attention and care of those who know them. When people forget a place, when they stop walking its paths and speaking its name, when they let it slip from memory and story, that place begins to fade. It doesn't disappear entirely. Places are more stubborn than that, but it falls into a kind of sleep, a dormancy, waiting for someone to remember it, to wake it up again. And the Sleeping Valley has been asleep for 1,000 years, Finn asked. So the stories say, and they say something else too. Grandfather leaned forward, his dark eyes catching the firelight. They say the valley has a guardian, a being who was created by the valley itself in the moment before it fell asleep. The guardian's task is to wait and watch, to keep the valley safe in its slumber, and to recognize the one who will finally wake it when they come. Finn felt something stir in his chest, something that felt like excitement and longing and recognition all mixed together. How would someone wake it? Grandfather smiled, a slow, knowing smile. That, my boy, is the question. The stories say that the one who can wake the valley must bring 3 things: a question without an answer, a truth that no one believes, and a dream that has never been dreamed before. Bring these 3 gifts to the guardian, and the valley will wake. Fail to bring them, and the valley will sleep on. Has anyone tried? Finn asked. I'm sure many have tried over the centuries, Grandfather said, but the valley sleeps still, so either no one has brought the right gifts, or no one has found the guardian at all. Or perhaps, he paused, his eyes distant, perhaps the right person simply hasn't come along yet. Perhaps the valley is waiting for someone specific, someone who won't come looking for glory or treasure, but for something else entirely. That night, Finn lay in his attic bed, unable to sleep, his mind full of the sleeping valley. He imagined trees with singing leaves, flowers in impossible colours, a spring with healing waters. He imagined a guardian waiting patiently for 1,000 years, watching over wonders that no one else could see. And he wondered, with a wondering that felt like certainty, like knowledge, if perhaps he was meant to find it. The next morning at breakfast, Finn found himself unable to think about anything except the Sleeping Valley. He pushed his porridge around his bowl, barely tasting it, his mind 1,000 miles away on windswept moors and hidden valleys. Grandfather noticed, of course. He noticed everything, but he didn't say anything immediately, just watched Finn with those sharp dark eyes, waiting. Finally, Finn set down his spoon and looked up. Grandfather, the Sleeping Valley. Is it real? I mean truly real, not just a story. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around his teacup, steam rising and curling in the morning light. What do you think makes something real, Finn? It was a very grandfather-like answer, responding to a question with another question, making you think instead of simply telling you. Finn had learned to expect this, even to appreciate it, though sometimes it was frustrating. I suppose, Finn said slowly, thinking it through, something is real if it exists, if you can touch it and see it and know it's there. Grandfather said noncommittally, and yet, is love real? Is hope? Is memory? You can't touch them, can't hold them in your hands, and yet I think we'd both agree they exist. Finn frowned, considering this. That's different, though. Those are feelings, ideas. A valley is a physical place. Either it exists or it doesn't. Perhaps, Grandfather said. Or perhaps the world is stranger than we usually allow it to be. Perhaps there are places that exist in a different way than the places on maps. Places that you can only find when you're ready to find them, when you need them. Tell me. Finn. Why are you asking? Why does it matter to you whether the Sleeping Valley is real? Finn looked down at his porridge, at the patterns the honey made swirling through the oats. Because, he said quietly, I want to find it. I've wanted to since the moment you told me about it last night. It's like it was waiting for me to hear about it, like I was supposed to know. Does that sound foolish? Not at all, Grandfather said, and his voice was gentle, warm. Not at all. In fact, I thought you might feel that way, which is why I have something to show you. He rose from the table and disappeared into its study. Finn heard him moving about, the sound of books being shifted, a drawer opening. When he returned, he carried a large, or old book, the kind with a leather cover darkened by age and pages with uneven edges that showed they'd been cut by hand rather than machine. Grandfather set the book on the table and opened it carefully. It was a book of maps, Finn saw. Old maps, hand-drawn, of the region around Thornwick. Some showed the village as it was now or close to it. Others showed it as it had been centuries ago, when it was smaller, when the moor extended closer, when roads and buildings that no longer existed were marked in faded ink. Grandfather turned the pages slowly, carefully, until he came to one near the back of the book. This map was older than the others, drawn in brown ink that had faded to a pale sepia. It showed the moor stretching out in all directions from Thornwick, all marked with little symbols indicating hills and streams and ancient standing stones. "Look here," Grandfather said, pointing to the edge of the map where the parchment was slightly torn and stained. "What do you see?" Finn leaned close, squinting at the faded marks. At first he saw nothing unusual, just the end of the map where the cartographer had stopped drawing. But then, in the very margin, drawn in ink so pale it was almost invisible, he saw words. Tiny words, written in a script so old-fashioned he had to puzzle out the letters one by one. "Here sleeps the Valley of Dreams," he read aloud slowly, "guarded by the one who waits, bring 3 gifts to wake what sleeps." Below the words was a symbol, a spiral within a circle, simple but elegant. Finn's heart began to beat faster. "This map is old?" 300 years at least, Grandfather confirmed. Maybe older. "I found this book in a shop in Edinburgh 30 years ago, when I was researching the history of this region. I bought it for its maps of Thornwick, but I didn't notice this notation in the margin until years later. I'd forgotten about it, actually, until recently." "Recently?" Finn echoed. Grandfather smiled. "Until last week, when I woke from a dream of a valley filled with singing trees and flowers in colours I'd never seen. In the dream, someone was calling me, but I knew somehow that the call wasn't for me, as not really. It was for someone younger, someone with a different destiny. And when I woke, I thought of you, and I thought of this map, and I thought it was time to tell you the story." Finn stared at his grandfather, his mind reeling. "You think I'm supposed to find it? The Sleeping Valley? You think I'm meant to wake it?" "I don't know," Grandfather said honestly, "but I think you might be. Or at least, I think you should try, if it's what you want. Not because I'm telling you to, but because you feel called to it. That calling, that sense that something is waiting for you, that you're meant to do something, that's important, Finn. That matters. Most people never feel it. Those who do should pay attention." Finn looked back at the map, at the tiny words in the margin, at the spiral symbol. How would I find it? If it's not on the map, if it can't be found on any compass, how would I even know where to look? "Ah," Grandfather said, and he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. He placed it on the table beside the open book. It was a pendant on a leather cord, a disc of stone about the size of a large coin, smooth and dark. Carved into its surface was the same symbol Finn had seen on the map, a spiral within a circle. "This was in the book when I bought it," Grandfather explained, "tucked between the pages near this map, as if whoever hid it there wanted it to be found by someone who had noticed the margin note. I've carried it with me ever since, not quite knowing why, just feeling that it was important. Now I think I know. I think it was meant for you." Finn picked up the pendant carefully. The stone was cool and smooth, pleasant to hold, and heavier than he expected. As his fingers closed around it, he felt something. A faint vibration, almost like a heartbeat, or perhaps like the pendant was humming a note too low to hear but just possible to feel. "What does it do?" he asked. "I don't know exactly," Grandfather admitted. "I've carried it for 30 years and never felt anything from it. But you, I think you're different. I think it will guide you if you trust it. If you decide to go looking for the Sleeping Valley, wear this and see where it leads you." Finn slipped the cord over his head, letting the pendant rest against his chest beneath his shirt. The moment it touched his skin, the humming sensation grew stronger, not uncomfortable, but definitely present, definitely real. "When should I go?" he asked. Grandfather smiled. "Today is as good as any day. Pack yourself a lunch, dress warmly. You know how the weather can change on the moor, and see where the pendant leads you. But Finn, promise me something." "Anything," Finn said. "Promise me you'll be careful. You promise me you'll turn back if things feel wrong or dangerous. Promise me you'll trust your instincts, and promise me you'll be home before dark." "I promise," Finn said solemnly. An hour later, Finn was ready. He wore his sturdiest boots, the ones with good thick soles and leather that came up over his ankles. He wore his warmest jacket, a wool coat that had been his father's when he was a boy, taken in by Grandfather's skilled hands to fit Finn's smaller frame. In his rucksack he carried a lunch that Grandfather had packed: bread and cheese and cold chicken, an apple, a flask of water, and some of the oatcakes left over from breakfast. He had a small knife on his belt, useful for 100 things on the moor. He had matches in a waterproof tin just in case. He had a blanket rolled and strapped to his pack, and around his neck, hidden beneath his shirt, the stone pendant hung cool and solid, its faint humming like a second heartbeat. Grandfather walked him to the door. "Remember your promises," he said, his hand on Finn's shoulder. "I will," Finn said. Then, on impulse, he hugged his grandfather tight. Marcus hugged him back, his arms strong despite his age. "Be safe," Grandfather whispered, "and if you find it, if you wake the valley, come home and tell me all about it." "I will," Finn promised again. And then he was off, walking through the village with quick, eager steps, past the church and the school and the general store, past the last house where Mrs. Blackwell was hanging laundry, and called out a cheerful good morning, past the cultivated fields where early autumn crops were growing, past the carefully maintained stone walls that mark the boundary between village land and the wild moor. And then he was on the moor proper, with heather stretching away in all directions, with the wind in his face and the sky overhead, and the pendant against his chest humming its subtle, certain song. He walked without knowing exactly where he was going, but with complete confidence that he was going the right way. The pendant seemed to pull gently, not physically, but somehow else, like a sense he'd never had before but understood immediately. It was as if he'd grown a new organ for perception, one that sensed direction and rightness, the way his eyes sensed light, or his ears sensed sound. This way, it seemed to say, this direction, keep going. He followed sheep paths and deer tracks he'd walked 100 times before, but today they felt different, charged with possibility. He crossed small streams by jumping from stone to stone, the water running clear and cold over smooth pebbles, singing its ancient song of mountain and rain and the patient work of erosion. He climbed hills he'd climbed before and descended into valleys he thought he knew, but everything seemed subtly changed, as if he were seeing it all through new eyes. The heather was blooming in full purple glory, and the air was thick with the hum of bees gathering their last harvest before winter came. Butterflies danced among the gorse flowers, small blues and common browns, and once startlingly a painted lady, its wings a riot of orange and black and white. Finn had always loved butterflies, loved how something so delicate could be so determined, flying hundreds of miles on wings that seemed too fragile to support them. He stopped once to drink from his water flask and eat an oatcake, sitting on a flat rock that was warm from the sun. Around him, the moor stretched away in all directions, rolling and folding like a blanket that had been carelessly thrown across the land. In the distance he could see the dark line of the forest that marked the boundary of Lord Ashford's estate, and beyond that, hazed by distance, the mountains that marked the edge of the known world, or at least the edge of the world Finn knew. He wondered what lay beyond those mountains. Other villages, certainly, cities probably. The sea eventually, though it was weeks of travel away. But also, perhaps, other places like the Sleeping Valley, places that existed in the margins of maps, places that couldn't be found unless you knew how to look, places where magic still lived and breathed and waited for those who needed it. The thought filled him with a strange longing. He loved Thornwick, loved his life with grandfather, loved the quiet rhythms of their days, but he also longed for something more, something he couldn't quite name. Adventure, perhaps, but not the kind from stories with dragons and swords. Something quieter, deeper, the adventure of discovery, of understanding, of finding places and things and truths that most people never knew existed. Maybe, he thought, that was what the Sleeping Valley represented. Not treasure or glory, but knowledge. The knowledge that the world was stranger and more wonderful than it appeared, that magic was real in ways both subtle and profound, that there were still mysteries to solve and wonders to find. He finished his oatcake, drank more water and stood. The pendant's pull was stronger now, more insistent. He was getting close. Time seemed to behave strangely as he walked on. He felt as though he'd been walking for only an hour, but when he checked the sun, it was well past noon, sliding toward the western horizon. He felt as though he'd come only a few miles, But when he looked back, Thornwick was nowhere to be seen, hidden by the curve of the hills and the distance he'd somehow covered without noticing. The landmarks he knew, the standing stones, the old shepherd's hut, the twisted oak that grew improbably in a hollow, were all gone, replaced by landscape he didn't recognize, but he wasn't worried. The pendant knew where he was going, and he trusted it completely. This trust surprised him a little. He was generally a cautious boy, one who thought things through, but somehow he knew deep in his bones that he was safe, that he was exactly where he needed to be. The moor began to change. The heather grew thicker, taller, creating waves of purple that rose to his waist. Flowers he'd never seen before appeared among the familiar ones, strange blooms with petals that seemed to shimmer in the sunlight, giving off scents both sweet and sharp, like honey mixed with pine. The grass beneath his feet grew softer, springier, as if the earth itself were preparing him for something special. Birds he didn't recognize flew overhead, or perhaps they were familiar birds behaving in unfamiliar ways. A lark descended in spirals, singing a melody so complex and beautiful it brought tears to Finn's eyes. A pair of ravens circled, calling to each other in voices that sounded almost like speech, almost like they were commenting on his journey, encouraging him onward. The pendant's humming grew stronger, more insistent, until Finn could not only feel it, but hear it. A low note that resonated in his chest and seemed to make the air around him vibrate in sympathy. This way. Closer now. Very close. Keep going. He climbed one more hill, steeper than the others, his legs burning with the effort, his breath coming fast. At the top he paused to catch his breath, turned to look back the way he'd come, and saw nothing but moor stretching endlessly away. Thornwick might have been a dream. His whole previous life might have been a dream. There was only this moment, this hilltop, this journey toward something he couldn't name but knew was important. He turned back to face forward, and his breath caught in his throat. The valley lay before him. The valley lay before him like a secret folded into the landscape, invisible until you were right upon it, hidden by the peculiar way the hills arranged themselves. It was deeper than the gentle valleys Finn was used to, steeper, more dramatic. The sides were covered with forest, not the sparse, windswept trees that managed to survive on the exposed moor, but proper, thick forest with trees that grew tall and straight, their canopy dense and green. But there was something odd about the forest, something that made Finn catch his breath. It was too still. No wind moved the leaves, no bird sang the branches. The whole valley had a quality of suspension, as if it were a painting rather than a real place, as if it existed outside of time. The sleeping valley. It had to be. Finn began to descend, picking his way carefully down the steep hillside. The moment he crossed some invisible threshold and entered the valley proper, everything changed. The air became warmer, softer, scented with flowers, though Finn couldn't see any. The light took on a golden quality, as if filtered through honey, and the silence deepened into something profound, something that wasn't the absence of sound, but rather the presence of a very deep, very patient waiting. His footsteps made no sound on the thick moss that carpeted the valley floor. He walked between trees that rose like pillars in a cathedral, their bark smooth and silvered, their branches reaching overhead to create a canopy that glowed with soft green light. As he walked, then he began to notice things that confirmed this was no ordinary place. The trees were breathing. He could see it. A very slow, very gentle expansion and contraction, as if they were sleeping creatures seeing dreams of earth and water and sunlight. The moss beneath his feet was impossibly soft, impossibly green, and it glowed very faintly, providing light even in the shadows where sunlight didn't penetrate. Flowers grew in the moss, flowers unlike any Finn had ever seen. Some were shaped like bells, but seemed to be made of crystal, catching the light and throwing tiny rainbows across the ground. Others looked like stars, but opened and closed in a rhythm like breathing. Their petals' colours Finn had no names for. Not quite purple, not quite blue, but something in between that seemed to shift as he looked at it. He walked deeper into the valley, following what might have been a path or might have just been a slightly clearer space between the trees. The pendant against his chest was warm now, almost hot, and humming so strongly he could hear it, a low note that resonated in his bones. And then he came to the spring. It emerged from the base of a cliff at the far end of the valley, water flowing from a crack in the stone to pool in a basin of white rock, before overflowing to create a small stream. The water was absolutely clear, so clear it looked like liquid crystal, and it glowed with the same soft light as the moss. Steam rose from it, curling in lazy spirals, though when Finn held his hand in the steam he felt no heat, just a pleasant warmth like sunlight on skin. Beside the spring, sitting on a flat stone as smooth and white as polished marble, was a figure, and at first Finn thought it was a statue. It sat so perfectly still, and its form had a quality of permanence, as if it had been there forever and would remain forever, outlasting mountains and rivers and the very stars themselves. But as he approached, moving slowly, reverently, as if entering a sacred space, he saw it breathe, saw its chest rise and fall in the same slow, measured rhythm as the trees around it breathed. It was difficult to say what the guardian looked like exactly. Its form seemed to shift slightly depending on how Finn looked at it, as if it existed partly in reality and partly in dream, partly in this world and partly in some other. Sometimes, when he looked at it directly, it seemed human. An old man with a beard like flowing water, silver white and long, with eyes like deep pools that reflected the sky. The man's face was lined with age but beautiful in its wisdom, and he wore robes that might have been woven from mist or moonlight. But when Finn looked at it from the corner of his eye, or when he wasn't quite focusing, the form shifted. Sometimes it seemed like an animal, a great stag with antlers that branched and rebranched like the limbs of ancient trees, each point tipped with something that might have been bone or might have been crystal. The stag's coat was dappled like sunlight through leaves, and its eyes held the same deep wisdom as the old man's. Sometimes it seemed like neither and both, something else entirely, something that had no name because it was unique in all the world. Sometimes Finn thought he saw wings folded against its back. Sometimes he thought he saw roots, as extending down from where it sat into the earth itself, as if the guardian were as much a part of the valley as the trees or the spring. Sometimes it seemed to be made of light, or of shadow, or of the substance of dreams themselves. But whatever form it took, whatever aspect it showed, its eyes were constant, dark and deep and infinitely kind, patient with the patience of stone that has weathered 10,000 storms, wise with the wisdom of things that have watched the world turn for ages uncounted, watched empires rise and fall, watched forests grow and die and grow again, watched the slow dance of the stars across the vault of heaven. Finn stopped a few paces away, suddenly unsure. How did you greet a guardian that had been waiting for 1,000 years? What did you say to a being that was both human and animal and neither? That seemed to exist in multiple forms at once. But before he could speak, the guardian spoke first, and its voice was like nothing Finn had ever heard. It was like wind in leaves, whispering secrets that had been kept since the world was young. It was like water over stone, patient and persistent and eternal. It was like the earth itself speaking, deep and resonant and solid. It was all these things and none of them. A voice that seemed to speak not just to his ears, but to his bones, to his blood, to the deepest parts of himself. "Hello, young seeker," the guardian said, and though the words were simple, they carried weight, carried meaning beyond their surface. "I have been waiting for you." Finn found his voice, though it came out smaller than he'd intended, thin and young and uncertain in the face of this ancient presence. "Waiting for me? Specifically for me? You've been waiting 1,000 years just for me?" The guardian's mouth, or beak, or muzzle, depending on how Finn was seeing it in that moment, curved in what might have been a smile. "I've been waiting for someone," it said. "For the one who would come with the 3 gifts. The one who would be brave enough to seek, curious enough to wonder, open enough to find. Whether that is you, we shall see. Many have come over the centuries drawn by rumours or maps or dreams. Most turned back before they reached the valley. Some entered but left again, deciding they had better things to do. A few stayed for a time but could not provide what was needed. You're the first in many, many years to come this far with a pendant warm against your heart. Are you the one who can wake the valley?" "I don't know," Finn said honestly, and the honesty felt important. Felt like something the guardian would value. "I want to be. I felt called to come here, felt like I was meant to find this place. But I don't know if I have what you need. I don't know if I'm special enough or wise enough or anything enough." The guardian's smile deepened, becoming warmer, more encouraging. Honesty, self-doubt paired with hope, humility paired with courage. "That's a good beginning, young Finn. Better than you might think. Tell me, do you know what the 3 gifts are?" "A question without an answer," Finn recited, remembering what grandfather had told him, remembering the words written in faded ink in the margin of an ancient map. "A truth that no one believes. And a dream that has never been dreamed before." "Just so," the guardian said, inclining its head in approval. "The 3 gifts that no one can prepare, that no one can study for, that must come from the heart and the mind and the soul, rather than from books or learning. Have you brought these gifts?" Finn's heart sank. He had been so focused on finding the valley, on reaching the guardian, on following the pull of the pendant, that he hadn't actually thought about what he would say when he got here. What question didn't have an answer? What truth did no one believe? What dream had never been dreamed? These seemed like impossible riddles, like puzzles with no solutions. I don't know," he admitted, his voice wavering. "I didn't prepare anything. I just came because I felt called to come. I didn't think about... I thought about the gifts, but I couldn't figure out what they meant, couldn't think of any answers that seemed right. I just hoped that when I got here I would know. But now I'm here and I don't know, and I feel like I've failed before I've even really begun." The words tumbled out in a rush, his disappointment and frustration evident. He'd come all this way, had followed the pendant across the moor, had found this impossible valley that existed in no direction a compass could show, and now he was going to fail because he didn't have the right answers to impossible questions. But the guardian didn't look disappointed. Instead, it leaned forward, its eyes, whether human or animal or something else, fixed on Finn with an intensity that was both intimidating and somehow comforting. "Called," it said, and the word resonated. He seemed to hang in the air between them. "Tell me about this calling. Tell me what you felt, what you feel. Tell me why you're here." So Finn did. He told about hearing the story from grandfather, about the feeling that had filled him when he learned about the Sleeping Valley. A feeling like recognition, like homecoming, like being told about something he'd always known deep down but had forgotten. He told about the map in the margins and the pendant with its spiral symbol, and how it had led him here through pathways he didn't know existed. He spoke from his heart, honestly, holding nothing back, letting his words flow like the spring's water, clear and pure and unfiltered. He told about growing up different, about preferring solitude to company, about loving the moor when other children found it boring. He told about his grandfather, about the bond they shared, about the books and stories and quiet evenings by the fire. He told about feeling like he didn't quite fit in the normal world, but not knowing where he did fit, not knowing where he belonged. "And when I heard about this place," Finn said, his voice soft but certain, "something in me said yes, said this is important, said you need to find this. I can't explain it better than that. It was just a knowing deep in my bones that I was meant to be here, that this mattered." When he finished, the Guardian was quiet for a long moment, the silence profound and patient. Around them, the valley continued its slow breathing, the trees rustling very gently though there was no wind, the spring singing its quiet song, the light filtering through the canopy in shafts of gold and green. Then the Guardian spoke, and its voice was gentler than before, filled with something that might have been approval or compassion, or perhaps simply recognition. "The gifts are not things you prepare, young Finn. They are not answers you can study for or memorize. They are things that come from who you are, from the way you see the world. The first gift, the question without an answer. What does that mean to you?" Finn thought hard. A question without an answer. Not a question that no one had answered yet, but a question that couldn't be answered. A question that by its nature had no answer. And then it came to him. "Why does anything exist at all?" he said slowly. "Why is there something rather than nothing? Why does the world exist? Why do we exist? Why is there anything? There's no answer to that. There can't be. Because any answer you give just raises the same question about the answer itself. It's a question that goes on forever, without resolution." The Guardian's eyes gleamed. "Yes, that is indeed a question without an answer. You have brought the first gift, though you didn't know you carried it. Now what of the second? A truth that no one believes." Finn thought again. A truth that no one believed. But if it was true, why would no one believe it? Unless it was a truth that couldn't be proven, a truth that you could only know in your heart. "That every moment matters," Finn said quietly. "That every small thing we do, every kind word or unkind word, every choice we make, ripples outward and changes the world in ways we can't see or measure. People say they believe that, but they don't really. They think most of what they do doesn't matter, that they're too small to make a difference. But it's not true. Everything matters. Every moment is shaping what comes next. It's a truth, but almost no one truly believes it deep down where it counts." "Yes," the Guardian said softly. "Yes, another gift received, and now the third, which is perhaps the hardest, a dream that has never been dreamed before. How can you know what dreams others have dreamed? How can you know what has never been?" This one was harder. Finn stood in silence thinking, while the Guardian waited with infinite patience. Around them, the sleeping valley breathed its slow breaths. The water from the spring sang its quiet song, and time moved according to its own rules. And then Finn understood. It's not about knowing what others have dreamed, he said. It's about dreaming something so uniquely mine, so specifically from my own heart and mind and experience, that it couldn't have been dreamed by anyone else, because everyone is unique, everyone sees the world in their own way. A dream that's truly mine, truly from my deepest self, is by definition a dream that's never been dreamed before. And what, the Guardian asked gently, is your dream? Finn closed his eyes. He thought about what he wanted, what he hoped for, what he longed for in his secret heart. And when he opened his eyes, he spoke the truth. I dream of a world where no one has to be lonely, where everyone finds their place, their people, their purpose, where solitary people like me and Grandfather are understood and valued, where we don't have to pretend to be different than we are, where valleys can sleep and wake as they need to, where magic is recognized and honored, where the boundaries between possible and impossible are softer, kinder, where everyone belongs somewhere, somehow. That's my dream. The silence that followed was profound. Then, slowly, the Guardian stood. As it rose, its form solidified, becoming clearer, more defined. It was ancient and young at once, human and not human, real and dreamlike. You have brought all three gifts, it said, and its voice was filled with something that might have been joy or relief, or perhaps simply recognition. The question without an answer, the truth that no one believes, and the dream that has never been dreamed. You have brought them not because you prepared them, but because they are part of who you are. And so, young Finn, the valley will wake. The Guardian reached out and touched the pendant that hung against Finn's chest. The moment its finger met the stone, everything changed. The valley took a breath, not the slow, sleeping breaths it had been taking, but a deep, full, waking breath. The trees shivered and their leaves rustled, creating a sound like distant music. The flowers began to bloom more fully, their colours intensifying, and Finn realised he could now see colours he'd had no names for before. New colours, impossible colours, colours that seemed to exist in dimensions beyond the normal spectrum. The spring's water began to flow more strongly, and its song grew louder, becoming a melody that was complex and beautiful and somehow familiar, as if Finn had always known it but had forgotten until this moment. Birds appeared in the trees, not flying in, but simply appearing, as if they'd been there all along waiting to be noticed, and they began to sing in harmony with the spring. The Guardian itself seemed to grow more solid, more present, more vividly alive. It smiled at Finn, and its smile was like sunrise after a long night. "Thank you," it said. "For 1,000 years I have waited, and now the waiting is done. The valley is awake, the healing spring will flow again, the singing trees will share their music, and all who need this place will be able to find it, as you did, by following the pull of their own hearts." "What happens now?" Finn asked. "Now," the Guardian said, "the valley lives again, and you, having woken it, are forever connected to it. You can return whenever you wish, whenever you need healing or peace, or simply to remember that magic is real. Your grandfather may come too if he wishes. I know he has longed to see this place, though he thought himself too old. Age matters not in the sleeping valley. Only the heart matters." Finn felt warmth spread through his chest, a happiness so pure and complete it almost hurt. He had done it. He had found the valley and woken it with nothing but his honest heart and his true self. "I should go home," he said. "Grandfather will worry if I'm late." "Then go," the Guardian said. but take this with you." It reached down to the spring and filled a small vial, which appeared in its hand as if it had always been there, with the glowing water. It stoppered the vial and handed it to Finn. "Healing water from the heart of the valley, for your grandfather who grows old and whose bones ache in winter, and for anyone else who needs it. The vial will never empty, no matter how much you pour from it. Use it wisely and well." Finn took the vial carefully, tucking it into his inner pocket where it would be safe. Thank you for everything." "Thank you," the Guardian replied, "for seeing what needed to be seen, for caring enough to try, for being exactly who you are. Those are greater gifts than you know." Finn turned to go, then paused. "Will you be lonely here, now that the valley is awake, but I'm leaving?" The Guardian laughed to sound like bells. "I am never lonely. The valley's my companion, and now that it wakes, there will be others who find their way here, including you, whenever you return. Go now, young Finn. Go home to your grandfather and tell him everything. The valley will be here, waiting. Keyao, whenever you need it." So Finn left the sleeping valley, the now waking valley, and began the journey home. The pendant guided him back the way he'd come, though the journey seemed much shorter now, as if distance itself had contracted. The sun was just touching the western horizon when he saw Thornwick in the distance, its chimneys sending up their evening smoke, its windows beginning to glow with lamplight. Grandfather was standing at the gate when Finn arrived, as if he'd been watching for him. His face broke into a smile of relief and joy when he saw his grandson. "You found it," he said. It wasn't a question. "I found it," Finn confirmed. "I woke it, and I brought you something." He pulled out the vial of glowing water and told Grandfather everything, every detail of his journey, every word the Guardian had spoken, every wonder he'd witnessed. As he spoke, he poured a small amount of the healing water into a cup and gave it to his grandfather. Marcus drank, and as he did, the lines of pain that had creased his face for years, pain he'd never complained about but that Finn had seen, eased and smoothed. He straightened, his back losing some of its stoop, and when he smiled, it was with a lightness Finn had never seen before. "Magic," Marcus whispered. "True magic. Oh, my boy, what a gift you've given. To me, to the valley, to the world." That night they sat together by the fire as always, but everything felt different. The same, but deeper somehow, more true. Finn understood now what Grandfather had been trying to teach him all along, that the world was stranger and more wonderful than most people knew. That magic was real if you knew how to recognize it, that the most important journeys were the ones you took toward your own heart's calling. And somewhere in the hills beyond the moor, in a direction that couldn't be found on any compass, the valley that had slept for 1,000 years was waking fully, its trees singing, its flowers blooming in impossible colours, its guardian watching over it with patient joy, waiting for the next soul who would need what it had to offer. The sleeping valley was sleeping no more, and so our second journey ends, with a valley awakened and a boy who learned that the truest gifts come not from preparation, but from being courageously, honestly yourself. If this story brought you peace, subscribe for more bedtime adventures. Until tomorrow night, sleep well, and let your own heart guide you toward what you're meant to find.